In her speculative fiction novel, The Word for World is Forest, Ursula Le Guin tells the story of suffering, struggle, and resistance of the people indigenous to planet Athshi, as they are colonized by Terrans. Athshi means forest, a word that also is their name for world. The Athshians conceived their originary and ontological substance to be branch and root. In contrast, the Terran colonizers are said to be named after Earth, Terra, Tellus, meaning both the soil and their planet. Their originary and ontological substance is therefore clay, red dust. Of course, like all Le Guin's speculative anthropological fiction, this story is also sociopolitical history. And as I will discuss later on, these naming words connect origins, material belonging, and ontology to histories of colonialism and exploitation. For now, all that I need to say is that the rewording of Le Guin's evocative title into When the Word for World is Soil is meant as an invitation to explore ways in which contemporary transformations in human-soil relations, by developing soil-centered stories, could be reinventing a sense of belonging to a troubled earth. What follows are notes I have gathered through an ongoing research immersion in today's soil-centered worlds. They are organized around 4 themes, bringing together transformations in scientific concepts, practices, and creative aesthetics around soils. My notes also emphasize, for all of these, ethical obligations that they might involve. But before I start, it is important to say that the soil-centered worlds I dwell in are situated by a historical global north inheritance of anthropocentric technoscientific productionist and colonial exploitation of soils, conceived merely as a resource for human use, agricultural and beyond. Also, I need to say that these are worlds on Earth where historically symbolic and material connections where care for soils also conjures forms of othering, including totalizing histories of nationalism and associated forms of racism and xenophobia, are present, as shown, for instance, by Levi Van Sant's analysis with regards to the relation between soil surveys, nation construction, and reproduction of white supremacy in the United States, or by Daniel Münster's work on the connections between Hindu nationalism and alternative soil care practices. So how can we, in this context, rethink human soil belonging in ways that may open to insurgent, hopeful, decolonial ecological futures? How can human-soil relations help to disrupt exploitative inheritances of Earth belonging? Reading human-soil relations speculatively, setting such questions at the forefront, is a commitment to foster emerging alternatives. Transformations towards alternative human-soil relations are not neutral interventions. They are part of a movement embracing soil care and advocacy within an environmental crisis that is affecting soils globally. We could call this movement, as some have called themselves, a people for soils. Anna Krzywoszynska calls this a soil care network. Soil advocates know soils need help, and that care for them is care for those who depend on them, human or not. Soil erosion, depletion, pollution, and concealment are some of the damaging processes destroying soils today. In this context, as I'll try to show, these human-soil relations transformations call for specific ecological obligations of more than human care that both recognize and counter ambivalent inheritances of human soil belonging, in order to avoid perpetuating destructive anthropocentric and colonial relations with soils. A first message from contemporary soil-centered worlds is that the inheritors of productionist soil appropriation have been treating soil like dirt. Here, dirt is the negative pejorative qualifier for earth. It invokes inert and uninteresting matter. And so a transformative storyline embraced by People for Soils is that soils are alive, even equating soil with life itself, as implied in Vandana Shiva's imploration, without fertile soil, what is life? The living soil is not a new notion. It has, for example, a long tradition in organic agricultural movements, but it's fair to say that it has recently moved from margin to center of ecological cultures, and in doing so, it has adopted new features. One of these is the integration of bioscientific narratives that foreground and make visible soil's microbial life organized along ecological principles. If scientific soil aesthetics used to be mineral, and used to show mostly colorful soil profiles to demonstrate soil beauty, they now eagerly expose its biological wonders. Alongside is a move towards ecologically centered concepts of soil. Creatures do not live in the soil, but they are the soil. A food web model of soil ecology exemplifies this biologically centered concept of soil processes that emphasizes trophic dynamics between living beings. Today, living soil means that the ground that we walk upon is a living multispecies world, literally teeming with creatures. The new aesthetics of soil life are permeating a range of creative practices that draw and speculate with scientific imaginaries by engaging with soil microbial life. One beautiful example is this animated video by artists Alana Bartol and Amanda White as part of their Deep Earth project, which depicts soil creatures as if seen through a microscope, while a range of participatory artistic interventions are engaging also people to rediscover microbial soil life. The centrality of soil aliveness has not come naturally. Soil scientists recognize the influence of a surge in environmental consciousness in the second half of the 20th century, in a turn towards biological and ecological conceptions in a discipline that used to be dominated by physics and chemistry. In turn, soil activist education in the lineage of the living soil tradition appropriates and transforms living soil science and aesthetics to strengthen and vindicate a long-standing alternative tradition of living soil advocacy and also to foster specific practices of soil care. For instance, by introducing basics of microbiology in grassroots training of soil care and repair that aim to team up with microbial life to boost soil fertility. But again, making visible the soil is not a neutral affair. Sociologists of human-soil relations also show how making visible soil life brings also new forms of exploitation. The multispecies community is exposed to new forms of microbial appropriation as a new resource by extractive technoscientific logics. The speculative hope emerging from soil-centered worlds in this context is that the material teachings of the living soil imply an alternative human soil ontology. Soil activist education in particular emphasizes soil life-centered care as a practice by which humans are not just users or consumers of soils, but active members of a more than human soil community that exceeds human life. Soil living worlds do not belong to humans. Humans belong to them. This sense of ecological belonging to Earth as soil not only troubles species belonging, to borrow the words of the multi-species editing collective, but also reanimates the descendants of anthropocenic exploitative agriculture by requiring active obligations from them as members of the soil community. Living soil practitioners argue we shouldn't just grow from the soil, but also grow soil with and for the soil. For instance, by returning composted organic matter to the soils instead of generating excess waste. Multi-species scientific food web models come to be identified with a more than human ethical practice based on the commoning of matter and respect for the integrity of the creatures that make it. Food justice and ecological justice are entangled. We have depleted life from soils beyond their capacity without giving back. Artificial fertilizers were brought as the solution to feed the world, but make soils and farmers dependent on agrocapitalism, pollute and deeply disturb ecological cycles. Nurturing the soil food web with excess organic matter is seen by soil activist educators like Elaine Ingham in the picture as a way to avoid harmful chemical fertilizers that cascade and damage ecosystems. It is also a way to protect farmers from cycles of soil depletion and death generated by relying on industrial inputs. Permaculturists see this sharing of circulating living matter as a fair share of extracted surplus, a regenerative human-soil connection for growers and non-growers. Practices of returning matter to the soil are core to another story from soil-centered worlds. Here, soil becomes a signifier of ecological cycles and of the inseparability of life and death. Visual ecologist Aviva Reed, inspired by scientific ecology, has created a performance lecture called Soil Biome Immersion. She uses sound, visuals, and tactile experience as she invites participants to think about human soil ecological ontology as matter that cycles nutrients temporarily through the planet and bites all organisms as ancestral remnants of each other. This story of a more than human soil community cycling matter through planet Earth integrates another popular scientific narrative, the epic of planet Earth's geocosmic origins, the one that tells us how chemical elements combine and recombine, transforming the dust of stars into increasingly complex compounds and ended up creating life. In other words, soils are a testimony that everything on Earth is matter, made of matter that has been matter of something else. As we die, we return to the soil. We are matter passing, shape-shifting forms through a finite Earth. But this is not a linear story of the creation of life. Earth cycles only create life by constantly decreating it. Soils embody the biogeochemical processes that made life on Earth as we know it, and this from the very basic scientific notion of their formation. Soil generation or pedogenesis is a processual concept most intimately related to the breakdown of matter through weathering and action of microorganisms. In this sense, the dynamic liveliness of soil geological, biological, and chemical processes features breakdown as an essentially collective form of agency. Soil material is composed over time with disintegrated, previously compounded matter that becomes habitat, food, and energy for other emerging living things before being broken down again, and so on. Again, in this storyline of more than human ecological belonging, Earth does not belong to humans. The grounded matter belongs to Earth and returns to it as part of a complex ongoing planetary arrangement of interconnected ecologies. Breakdown of human matter and infrastructures is part of human soil belonging to Earth. This retelling connects to obligations not only to embrace breakdown as part of human ontological identity, but also to assist breakdown. It connects domestic and down-to-earth practices of participating to cycles of decay, decomposition, and breakdown at ground level, such as those we may assist with composting practices in gardens and kitchens, natural burial sites, or promoting biodegradable materials, with a cosmic scale of Earth origins and cyclic perpetuation of life on this planet. Anthropologist Christina Lyons gives us a beautiful and compelling formula for these obligations: decomposition as life politics. It is a politics, as there is no neutral standpoint to start from for this vital work. There are no natural ecological cycles to return. As Dimitris Papadopoulos notes, it is easier to imagine the end of capitalism than a world without anthropogenic chemicals. Living within industrial agricultural inheritances means that broken down matter will be recirculated through Earth cycles that are already heavily disrupted by the contamination of harmful and degradable anthropogenic compounds. Embracing and assisting breakdown in this context is a requirement of an impure human soil ecological belonging, a call for nature cultural practices of healing the cycles that we keep contributing to disrupt. One of these healing practices that is inspiring soil advocacy is bioremediation. Often defined as working with nature to repair the earth, this denomination betrays the fact that these techniques are far from natural. Bioremediation is an ambivalent practice, is nature cultural, and this makes it more relevant for these times. It can refer to industrial technologies that we will need to dismantle the massive scale of damage of manufactured compounds, even if these industrial ways are often characterized by a clean-up and leave approach that ignores the wider ecosystems and relations. Bioremediation is also a practice in soil activist education that considers continuous community care as a requisite for successful repair of our environments. Bioremediation also inspires creative practices. For instance, this work by Jane Lawson engages with mycoremediation as she allies oyster mushrooms to help her decompose a volume of capitalism and freedom, the classic of neoliberal ideology. This way, she reminds that remediating will require assisting the breakdown of ways of life and thinking that have capitalized on extracting life from some to benefit others. More generally speaking, an obligation to assist breakdown confronts the inheritance of a conception of life that reduces it to an achievement of productivity, creativity, and its moral corollary, a cult of endurance. However, care for a multi-species biogeochemical soil community with awareness of the troubling exclusionary potentials of human soil ecological belonging means also recognizing that confronting the cult of endurance is not a neutral struggle. This powerful work by US-based artist Claire Pentecost helps to think with these tensions. For Claire Pentecost, US industrial agriculture is a weapon of mass destruction. More generally, seeing a flag as a symbol of agriculture reminds how soils, as Levi Van Sant and Daniel Münster show in different contexts, are material and symbolic investments of nationalism and colonial powers that reduce them to territorial conceptions of land and exclusionary forms of belonging, including blood and soil narratives. Thinking with these inheritances reminds that some have banked much more than others on the story of life as productivity and endurance, making profit from the breakdown of those they conceived as appropriable others. Namely, white industrial nationalist capitalist enterprises at the heart of biogeochemical and socioeconomic extractive dynamics have mostly obstructed the cycles of circulation of matter on Earth. The cult of endurance is not a given, but a historical privilege grounded on the exploitation of non-humans, but also all other ways of living with non-humans. And therefore, the obligation to embrace breakdown may bring specific obligations for the inheritors of the privilege of endurance, to dismantle white industrial privilege so that a potential for enduring might be redistributed rather than capitalized, so that other ways of living can flourish. And so, this flag, decomposed by soil microorganisms, may be a speculative image for the political significance of an ethics of breakdown within a more than human multispecies alliance to annihilate racist nationalism as a mode of human soil belonging. A more than human biogeochemical politics against colonial enterprises towards a regrounding of belonging beyond sociohistoric categories that make soil as land the sole ground for territorial kinship and community. It nurtures the hope that the struggle to redefine ecological relations with soil at ground and planetary levels relies on an alliance with the other beings who depend on living soils. The next storyline I propose to approach, also inspired by contemporary human-soil relations, also engages with soils as composed from remnants of matter. Soils are archives of the remains of natural, social, cultural, and economic histories. Here, also the material and the semiotic potential of human-soil relations share significance with inheritances, plenty of tensions and ambivalences. I try to convey these by engaging with contrasting three very different engagements with soils as memory, as archives of materialist history, that all connect soil samples and gather them together, enacting complex rememberings. The first is this extraordinary artwork by Marianne Grieve called the One Earth Altar. It invites worship with a triptych made of 7,000 soil samples from across the globe, encased and classified in books of earth. Grieve describes the altar as bringing together the abstract perception of the entirety of the world into the individual experience of everyday uniqueness. Earth from many places on the globe, let us realize our common dependence on this thin layer of weather-beaten stone from which life takes its nutrition and in which it leaves its traces. This claim of common dependence from the soil is ethically and politically compelling as a speculative expression of common ecological belonging to Earth. Here, soils, with their double connotations of nutrition and archival memory of historical traces of human and Earth history, signify a portrait of Earth as one world that we share, connected as planetary humans by a thin layer that provides life. Grieve, however, sees this planet's soil as composed by the everyday uniqueness of a diversity of Earth grounds. So here the living, animated soil community is not about biological life, but about the spirit of a relational and irreducible diversity. An altar is a place of worship. What is worship here is the mystery of community that may connect different soil-centered worlds. Because, and in spite of this strong message, this piece raises the ambivalences in the strong lure of Earth as soil imaginaries, to generate harmonious conciliatory stories of human regrounding in a soil thought as something people across Earth might share in common. Without aiming to condemn this hopeful ecological imaginary, in which myself I tend to indulge, I propose a contrast with another soil archive to complicate this call. This image shows a soil sample archive created by the Community Remembrance Project of the Equal Justice Initiative in Atlanta. It is composed by jars of soil collected from lynching sites across the United States to create a memorial to victims of lynching. The soil samples have been collected by communities and often descendants, and each jar is named with the name of one of the victims. These are two very different soil archives, but both are spiritual memorials. One elevates soils as a celebration of spirit of a connected, interdependent community. The other is a tribute to lives lost and communities broken as a result of white supremacist murder. What connects them is a persistent understanding of soils as repositories of memory. As such, in these archival projects, soil as memory is predicated on the contrary of breakdown. Like with archaeological soils, what matters in soils as archive is what they have preserved, what has endured and resisted decomposition. I have hesitated to connect the soil archive of the Equal Justice Initiative within this story of human soil belonging quite a while. It is a gripping engagement of soil as material memory of suffering and struggles. But I don't find it easy from my position to speak about it in a way that respects its importance and complexity, that lends from this work with responsibility from my own privilege, that transforms how I feel and see rather than just appropriates the experience of others. What I have come to realize is that this story fits in the story of ecological belonging I am engaging with because it doesn't fit. Indeed, it further emphasizes how resisting breakdown matters in struggles of those who are systematically broken down and refuse the possibility to endure. Also because it deeply troubles the linearities of human soil ecological belongings. Reading this archive in the light of research on how Black people remain excluded from natural environments historically shaped by race violence reminds again that no landscape or ecology can be neutral today. As communities dig up soils for lost blood to enact a relation of justice, this memorial both makes present the exclusionary violence that belonging to soils has historically evoked, and deeply disrupts the mobilization of a narrative by which blood in the soil works for nativist exclusion or ownership of an original land. More than human approaches to belonging will need to take this deeply into account as well as nurture solidarities if we are to generate alternative ecological belongings that are accountable of the histories of soil. This means also learning from how also those excluded from soils have continued more than human relations in spite and within their struggles. My last notes on soils as material remembering engages with the scientific practice of soil sample archiving. One example is kept in the Rothamsted Research Centre in the UK. It has samples since 1843 from long-term experiments at the site, as well as thousands of soils collected from around the world in the 1920s to 1950s, and 200 soil samples that are added annually. Initially, samples were analyzed for their nutrient content, but with the development of analytical techniques, they have been used to detect atmospheric changes and even fallout from atomic bomb tests in the 1950s. They are thus archival sources to understand epochal marks left on the Earth crust. But could they also be potential witnesses of what geographer Catherine Yusuf calls geosocial strata? Thinking with the learnings of the Equal Justice Initiative archive, we can ask what material history could be told about these soils extracted from a soil lying on a small patch of the Earth crust called the UK. Could we dare to travel ourselves, displacing Donna Haraway's question for embodied situatedness, and ask with which blood these soils have been made? Could we then analyze soil samples predating artificial fertilizers, and would we find traces of guano, the natural fertilizer imported in mass from Peru in the second half of the 19th century? What are the links of these soils with the postcolonial dynamics that led to the guano wars? Could we continue writing socio-material histories tracing the progressive disruption introduced by chemical inputs? We can find inspiration again in Christina Lyon's work, who speaks of a poetics of soil health as she looks into a sample of Colombian soil through a petrographic microscope. In how she tells us about learning to see not only a composite of geological and biological processes, but also the material history of violence and hope, and of learning to feel too the body that looks into this microscope, how it has been also made from these histories and processes. In sum, a reinvention of ecological belonging involves the situated remembering of soils, so that we can become accountable and answerable for the stratifications that have continued to make today's more than human soil community, for better and for worse. To end, I come back to Ursula Le Guin's novel and to the troubles brought by a contrast between forest and soil people. As I mentioned at the start, the name of the world is Forest tells the story of a peaceful indigenous community living in planet Athshi, in intimate material and spiritual connection with their forest world. Their way of life is threatened by Terran colonizers who cut trees for wood and enslave forest people for labor. In order to survive, they are given no choice but to leave their peaceful ways behind and respond to Terran violence by turning material spiritual powers into violence. In this tale, harmed forests and people together bear the mark of settler colonialist violence, but also histories and futures of resistance. The contrast between Athshians forest people and earth soil people is introduced by the only Terran in the colony who tries to understand the inhabitants of planet Athshi and eventually becomes their ally. He had also come to love the Athshians' names for their own lands and places, and above all, Athshi, which meant the forest and the world. So earth, terra, tellus meant both the soil and the planet, two meanings and one. But to the Athshians, soil, ground, earth was not that to which the dead return and by which the living live. The substance of their world was not earth, but forest. Terran man was clay, red dust. Athshian man was branch and root. They did not carve figures of themselves in stone, only in wood. In this second quote, the civilian head of the colony, a personification of masculinist white supremacism, describes what is happening in one of the first settlements in the planet. He thought of the report from Dump Island of crop failures, massive erosion, a wipeout. He saw rain pouring down onto plowed dirt, churning it into mud, thinning the mud to a red broth that ran down rocks into the rain-beaten sea. The erosion had begun before. It looked like that Big Dome Keys, the colony's ecologist, was right, and that you have to leave a lot of trees standing where you want to plant farms. But he still could not see why a soybean farm needed to waste a lot of space on trees if the land was managed really scientifically. It wasn't like that in Ohio. If you planted corn, you grew corn, and no space wasted on trees and stuff. But then Earth was a tamed planet, and New Tahiti wasn't. That's what he was here for, to tame it. If Dump Island was just rocks and gullies now, then scratch it, start over on a new island and do better. Can't keep us down, we are men. The novel is an ecofeminist anti-colonial take on extractivist colonization and destruction led by a racist supremacist ideology. Projected into outer space fiction, it speaks, however, of a multitude of histories on planet Earth, histories of destruction of the more than human world and a diversity of ways of inhabiting it. The contrast of soil and forest people in particular invokes the historical specificity and contingency of any world naming. The Terran that Le Guin puts to speak is not any Terran, but the dominant colonial West. The etymology she cites for earth is the Latin terra. The origins of these soil people are not any soil either, but clay and red dust. These are soils of biblical significance. In Hebrew, Adamah is the red clay that made Adam. And so, What this speculative fiction remembers and projects into a future of outer space colonization is not only a deeply problematic inheritance of soil people, but the persistent and ongoing annihilation of other ways of naming the world that might not be grounded on this specific origin story. Worlds that once might have gone with other names for Earth. In turn, the description of the second quote is what happens to a soil left damaged after a forest clear-cut. The layer this adds for soil people's troubled origins history is the way in which non-Western forms of living from the land were devastated by European colonial agriculture. And what reading these two quotes to each other makes explicit is that for these terrans, the soil that makes them is made visible and significant by uncovering it, by stripping away vegetation to lay ground for plantations. The soil becomes a thing, a resource, because it's seen as a separate resource. This was not, nor needs to be, the only way to live on and with earth grounds. Making the soil visible, seeing the soil can actually be thought as an ecological anomaly. We can think here with soil advocates calling out on the plight of soils made bare, arguing for literally recovering soils. Christina Lyons here too, thinking with the Amazonian farmers she works with, shows how for them there is no such thing as a separate soil. Soils are inseparable from their forest, la selva. We can also think with permaculture and other soil activist educators and practitioners who are urging people to recover the soil, literally, by recreating forest mixed growing techniques. And farmers also are invited to grow cover crops during their non-growing season. But beyond these practices, more generally, remembering how soils have been laid bare to become a seen object for exploitation requires asking if, when focusing on soil as a distinct entity, we could still be contributing to its exploitative undoing. The ethos engaging with soils as a more than human form of community in soil-centered worlds is hopeful. In spite and because of ambivalent inheritances, it seems more than ever vital. These troubled legacies and mixed hopes expose that there is no such thing as a human future. From where we stand, futures can only be more than human. Emerging multispecies human soil ecological belongings can and should counter the inert story of a human made out of earthen by a one God to shape Earth into a one-world image. Today's soil-centered worlds are contributing to the collective retelling of multiple stories of ecological co-creation, breakdown and healing enacted by a diversity of more than human communities, hopefully enabling more just and livable worlds on this earth, worlds that might not yet have a word to name them.